Sony's had a bit of a rough go of it the past few years, and a lot of that can be attributed to their efforts to create a bunch of live service games that are super engrossing to people who aren't usually engaged with the single-player offerings that Sony puts out. And while that is a noble effort to some extent, and obviously it's a very noble effort from the business perspective, I think it has ultimately hurt Sony a lot, especially because it has really hurt their output of games. Recently, Sony has really gone down to only putting out 2 to 3 first-party games a year, and while that doesn't sound too bad on paper, I think it is really the optics of the situation that have really not gone in Sony's favor. First off, they're only putting out a couple games each year, and usually they are big games, but if they don't hit, it is kind of devastating. Like, take this year, take 2025 for example. The main 2 games we got were Death Stranding 2 on the beach in June, and then Ghost of Yotei in September. Well, Death Stranding 2, as much as I do absolutely adore that game, is a very niche. It is not a game for everybody, as the first one obviously wasn't, and while the second game is much more accessible, it's still not very accessible to people who already don't like the Kojima-isms and the extremely unconventional gameplay. And Ghost of Yotei, as I've stated in past videos, while a very solid, well-made, and beautifully crafted game, is not innovating at all over what the previous game did, and is not in itself a super exciting title, and it's not really a must-play. And so, for a lot of people who weren't grabbed by Yotei and frankly weren't interested in Death Stranding 2 from the start, this year's offerings from Sony have felt very sparse. So of course you're relying on third parties, and that makes you fall back on stuff like Borderlands 4 or Battlefield 6, or in the case of this year, we had a lucky break with Expedition 33 being like one of the best games ever made coming out, so there is that, but in a typical year, you wouldn't have something that amazing and anomalous coming out, right? Sony is usually the creator of at least one of the Game of the Year titles, and probably this year too, because one of them is getting nominated because it deserves it, and the other is probably there out of obligation. But, you know, even if there are more than, like, 2 to 3 first-party games, if Sony is publishing other games, say through, like, the China Hero project, or through just other companies kind of coming to Sony and, you know, not just exclusivity deals, but Sony's, like, literally publishing their game, they aren't marketed as PlayStation studios. They aren't from the core tentative studios that people expect Sony to be putting out, like, huge games from, you know? Like, take for example, Naughty Dog. As much as I love Naughty Dog and pretty much every Naughty Dog game except for The Last of Us 2, which I still haven't played yet, like, Naughty Dog is a company that people expect to put out amazing games, well-crafted stories, beautiful graphics, and all that, and ever since 2020, Naughty Dog has been re-releasing The Last of Us in every format they can, and I can tell you why, because the 2 seasons of the HBO show came out, and obviously that HBO show needed to be promoted with synergy with the games. Well, Naughty Dog isn't making a Last of Us 3 as far as we know right now. They're working on Intergalactic. So what do you do to put out some kind of Last of Us thing? Well, you do The Last of Us Part 1. Okay. Or you do The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered. Okay. Or you just do a Last of Us Complete Collection when the season ends, and you know, you just shove The Last of Us down people's throats. Now, of course, part of that is to kind of show people that Naughty Dog is still around, but this is also because they were developing a factions multiplayer game for the better part of 5 years before Sony finally canned the whole thing along with most of their other live service games. And so, you know, even if companies are putting out things, even if Sony's putting out the same amount of games they usually did, let's say that, like, in 2020, Sony had Okay, well, the 2020 is kind of a bad year, actually, because that's when the PS5 launched, so they had quite a few extra games. But let's take the PS4 offerings in 2020. You had, really, The Last of Us Part 2, and you had Ghost of Tsushima. And both of those were super high-profile, super innovative games, right? But, at the time, you also weren't hearing about the kinds of things you hear about now with Sony. The not layoffs, but like a studio closure, or, a game crashing and burning like Concord, or, hearing of a bunch of in-the-works live service games being canceled, or hearing about Bluepoint, a studio you really wanted to be working on their own original project, actually had spent the last 5 years working on a God of War multiplayer game that got canned. These are the kinds of things that demoralize, the player base and kind of push you back into that PS5 has no games moment. That joke that's been circulating basically forever. And, obviously there is truth to that. Every live service game that gets canceled is 5 years of development or less down the drain. These developers have to start back from the beginning. They have to go from scratch and create a whole new game. But beyond that, Sony has had a lot of leadership changes. Around the launch of the PS5, the PS4 leadership team around like Sean Layden and stuff kind of came and went, and Jim Ryan, a very normal corporate CEO, was put in charge, and that's who started the huge live service push. And when that clearly wasn't working, Jim Ryan was ousted, and now we have Herman Holst as the head of PlayStation Studios. Now, Herman Holst was the head of Guerrilla Games for a long time, and of course, Guerrilla Games, and Herman Holst specifically, is very, very, very proud of the Horizon series. And so, in our current day, we have had a leadership change. We have Herman Holst in charge now, and so of course, he was already in a pretty influential position within the PlayStation division already, but now it's even more so, right? He is actually in charge, where before he was able to influence and, Horizon gets a spotlight all the time. Aloy is considered one of the biggest Sony characters when she really shouldn't be. She's not that great of a character, and Horizon games don't sell well anyway. Now he's the head of PlayStation Studios and can push that even further, right? So obviously, I haven't actually seen any evidence of him doing that, but based on his previous things, this is kind of like if you put Neil Druckmann in charge of the entire PlayStation division, and he just shoved The Last of Us even more down everyone's throats than it already has been. Sure, The Last of Us is a great game, but I don't want to be hearing about it constantly like it's the only thing that exists, and that's what Horizon is for me now, right? Those games are pretty good, but God, hearing about Horizon at every chance, a Horizon movie, Horizon VR games, when's Horizon 3 coming out, Horizon's DLC, everything surrounding that, it just gets tiring for a series that I don't really feel completely deserves what it's really been given the recognition by Sony. But obviously, Sony might be changing, actually. I think there is a possibility that with the change in leadership and the success of Astro Bot in particular, we might actually see a bit of a shift in how Sony approaches developing these games. Obviously, Astro Bot won Game of the Year, and it really deserved that. That game was one of the best games ever made back then as well. And really, what it comes down to is Astro Bot did not have mocap, it did not have voice acting, it did not tell a cinematic story, it just had pure good gameplay, inventive levels, and some of the best music in like any game in a long time, right? So, okay, what does Sony take away from that? Make smaller games? Make shorter development times? Games with less budget that it's okay to not put out like a 50-hour movie game every year. You can put out some smaller titles, and it's not just that, but it's also Sony diversifying a little bit. Marvel Tokon seems to be a little bit of a diversification of Sony's portfolio right now, and I know that Tokon has probably been in development for a while, but I still think it is indicative to see, oh, Sony's doing a platformer. Oh, Sony's doing a 3 or a 4v4 fighting game. You know, something like that. Something really interesting and different rather than just, oh, Sony's doing another third-person action-adventure game with a cinematic story. You know, that sort of thing. Obviously, only time will tell. I don't know if Saros falls into the category of truly being innovative and different. I don't know if Returnal did either. I might pick it up. I might see how it does. But as it stands, Sony is kind of at a crossroads here. Obviously, Wolverine is coming out, and Intergalactic is somewhere off in space, probably 2027-ish. But I think for the near future, the fate of how Sony treats its studios and what the types of games it's releasing is really up in the air. I think you could go a way of Sony continuing to do the exact same thing it's been doing and probably not seeing a greater deal of new success, or them diversifying and really trying to go a bit more of a Nintendo route where they actually develop a good amount of different kinds of games, and they, you know, put out different experiences that different audiences want to see instead of just one thing that they think quote-unquote general audiences will really like. But, you know, only time will tell with that, so maybe I'll have to get back to you in 2 or 3 years, and we'll see how they're doing.